David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. The length of the CV is a reflection of my age, and it's only my mother that believes all of that stuff, I assure you. Normally when I start an address such as this, I ask members of the media to indicate who they are, just so that I understand who's in the audience. Equally distressing this evening, I notice there are some members of the Department of Finance and Deregulation here. Could you please indicate Stephen Clively? Are there any others, please? Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. It's very kind for you to be here. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, could I again thank David for his kind introduction and compliment Serco on the support that's been given both this evening and more widely to ASPI, and to acknowledge, I would like to acknowledge in this audience the long and very cooperative partnership that the Department of Defence has with Serco. To Stephen Loosley and the members of the board, to Peter Jennings, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here tonight. I am reminded that at this particular dinner, on the last two occasions, I think the last one you had an address from my friend and colleague David Hurley, and I think before that it was probably Ian Watt. So I'm following in rather awkward footsteps here. So we'll see where this takes us. You'll see from the title of what I want to speak about this evening that you will probably be very interested to hear what I have to say. Tonight I pay homage in some way to a most distinguished predecessor of mine, Sir Arthur Tang. He was in a very different category to me, but Sir Arthur was the Secretary of the Department, as most of you will know, from 1970 to 1979. He was in fact the Secretary when I was a young man, when I first joined the Defence Organisation, and I remember his very patrician figure and the fear that it stirred up in most people's hearts. Tang was one of the last great public service mandarins, and we may not see the like of that again. He was a diplomat, he was a strategist, a hard-nosed reformer. He was a man at the centre of groundbreaking reforms to the Defence Administration here in Australia. When the Whitlam government came to power in 1972, Tang was tasked by the then Defence Minister, Lance Barnard, to merge the three service departments into one Department of Defence, as most of you will know. He went about this task in his usual blunt way. In August 1973, he was invited to speak to a dinner not dissimilar to this. It was the annual conference known as the Chief of General Staff's exercise. It was attended by all of the Army star-ranked officers, and in his opening barrage, Tang attacked all three of the single services, criticising them for planning wars according to their own separate strategies, while taking a hearty swipe at their triplicated capability development systems. Tang had well and truly got under the skin of the audience, as you can imagine, after this started. He cut directly to the divide and conquer strategy. It was the heart of each service's ability to win funding for their own capabilities at the time. The grizzled veterans of World War II and Korea who were assembled in the room were outraged at Tang that a mere civilian would be lecturing them on the errors of their ways. And the address became known, as some of you may be aware, as the Tangerang. And it's quite famous, the Tangerang. It's lasted down through history. So let's jump forward 40 years. We're now a much more joint organisation than we were in 1973, but we're still fundamentally an organisation that consists of four tribes, of Navy, Army, Air Force and a civilian tribe. These tribal groups, we still have differing viewpoints on how Australia's national security is best achieved. Let me emphasise, however, that I see this as particularly healthy. Many commentators see this as being a weakness. I don't. I think it's healthy. I'd be worried, in fact, if we had a defence force or a defence organisation where people weren't passionate about future capabilities and interests and didn't fight in their respective professional corners. It would be a very sad and dull world indeed. I think it's testament to the strength of our community and to our global outlook that we're able to openly talk about such things. What really matters, of course, is how we bring all of this together. How do we bring it together at the strategic level? In 2012, we're a much better place than we've been during most of my working life in this respect. If you have a look at the situation now, we have a joint defence capability plan. We plan jointly, we operate jointly, we operate whole of government. All of these things were unknown back when Tang delivered his Tang harangue. Before you start worrying, I can assure you that I'm not going to repeat the Tang harangue tonight. However, Sir Arthur left us with another enduring maxim, which is where I want to go now. He said that, and I quote, "If you haven't talked dollars, you haven't talked strategy." Many of you will have read that before. I studied for some time in the United States, and there's any number of eminent United States commentators who have made a similar comment through history. Today, we're arguably facing one of the most challenging periods in our national security journey. Since Federation, we've usually seen high levels of defence expenditure at a time when there's been a high operational tempo. And it's very easy to trace defence expenditure through World War I spike, through World War II spike, through the spikes of Vietnam and Korea and so on. Today we have a situation where we have reduced defence expenditure while at the same time maintaining what I would describe as a relatively high operational tempo. So the obvious tension and the challenge of that would be apparent to all. We've also got some difficult decisions to make with our future force structure over the next 20 years as we retire off a number of principal platforms and we bring new capabilities online to replace those platforms we retire. The approaching end of life of type of many of our large and expensive platforms was addressed in detail in the Defence White Paper 2009. The Defence White Paper 2013, to be delivered, as you all know, by the middle of next year, is an opportunity to refine and update the judgments and the commitments that were made in the last white paper. Of particular note is that the recently released Defence Capability Plan makes clear that the big ticket items, and this is important, the Joint Strike Fighters, the air warfare destroyers, the future submarines, maritime patrol aircraft and so on, are still in the future program and will remain so at this time. Indeed, of the 180 odd projects that were in Defence White Paper 09, 170 of them are still progressing. The 10 that are not are projects which have been either rescoped or absorbed as a result of capabilities being covered off by other projects. So 170 of the 180 back in 2009 continue to this day and will continue into the foreseeable future. The government has recently agreed, as you know, to the purchase of 10 C-27 battlefield airlift aircraft, which will improve the ADF's ability to move troops and equipment. The Minister for Defence announced only today the approval to acquire the Growler capability for 12 of our Super Hornet aircraft. What I will say, however, is that as we move forward, Sir Arthur Tang's maxim about matching dollars to strategy must perpetually ring in our ears. Our aspirations must match our projected budget and resources. Tonight I want to try and highlight some of the issues that we face as an organisation. I'm going to talk briefly about three things. I want to talk to you about the defence as an organisation, where we sort of sit today. I want to talk about the priorities and change that face us immediately, and I want to talk about our strategic outlook. So, to the first of those issues, which is defence as an organisation. Successive Australian governments have funded defence to be an enabler, a doer, if you like, for our national security architecture. We do everything from flood relief at one end of the spectrum through to high-end warfare at the other, and everything in between. Our size alone is barely matched, as you know, by any other government organisation in Australia. We are both expansive and expensive. We have a workforce of nearly 106,000 people. This includes 83,000 members of the ADF and 22,000 Australian public servants. And despite reductions to our APS workforce, we are one of the largest employers in Australia. It's interesting to note that when compared against the UK and Canada, our ratio of uniform to non-uniform members in the defence organisation is about the same. They run at 27, 26 and 25%, and we're right in the middle at 26. I just wanted to make that point because it's often raised about how many we've got in uniform and out of uniform in the department. We own nearly 400 properties, including 72 significant bases. We own 25,000 buildings and over 3 million hectares of land located in both urban and rural settings. We have arguably one of the largest project management organisations in Australia in the Defence Material Organisation, and I acknowledge Warren King, who's in the audience this evening. DMO has around 200 acquisition projects on the books at any one time, and all of those are plus of $20 million, some of them, as you know, very much plus of $20 million. We operate in every state and territory in Australia in both urban and rural environments. We're currently deployed on 10 operations with personnel in 10 different overseas locations, as well as domestically and on border protection duties. And it's interesting to note the increasing number of APS staff that are involved in some of these overseas deployments. If you go to Tarin Kowt in Afghanistan or any of the places where we're deployed, you will find members of the APS staff, and I think that's quite an interesting development over the last few years. We're a major service delivery organisation. We deliver traditional corporate services ranging from ICT, human resources, financial management, as well as base support services. We manage the delivery of education and health services. We contribute half of the agencies of the Australian intelligence community, DSD, DIO, DIGO. Through Defence Science and Technology Organisation, we are the nation's second largest employer of scientists. And if we consider that the total government spending on ICT, total federal government spending on ICT is a tad over $5 billion, we represent about $1.3 billion of that, or 23 to 25% of government's ICT expenditure. Now, one of the hardest things for people to grasp who are not intimately familiar with the defence organisation is the issue about keeping defence at the technological edge. Change and technological refresh is a constant for us, and the most advanced equipment is the most expensive, and it represents, of course, the greatest level of risk, and that includes the risk of project failure. And of course, some of those, ladies and gentlemen, are spectacular. Some of them have been inexcusable over the years. But nevertheless, we are at the cutting edge, and so project failure will from time to time be an occupational hazard. We have to take that risk in order to remain at the leading edge. The cost of procuring and maintaining this equipment continues to increase on average over time, and that's something that's not going to change anytime soon. In fact, Warren King can regale you with quite precise figures on how much military equipment is escalating as a cost through time. Let me say a few words about the economic circumstances that we face. You all know, unless you've been off the planet for the last couple of years, that we're in pretty straitened times, certainly in the Western world. We've recently had to make some very hard choices. The recent federal government budget, of course, the last budget, we contributed from the department nearly $5.5 billion to the government's fiscal strategy across the forward estimates, with nearly $1 billion of those dollars coming out of our budget in the current financial year. We've also had to reprioritise and reallocate approximately $2.9 billion across the forward estimates to offset the cost pressures of maintaining crucial capabilities like the Collins-class submarine and work on the surface fleet. All up, in this budget, we've reprioritised in excess of $8 billion across the forward estimates. That's been a substantial adjustment to our budget structure and our budget arrangements. This is fiscal reality, and although we've faced some pretty tough times in the past, we face tough times now. We're not facing any existential threat to our security. I think that's an important point to keep in the front lobe of your mind as you work your way through this sort of morass of figures. And I want to put it into perspective. We've reprioritised $8 billion, including this contribution of 5.5 to the fiscal strategy of the government over the forward estimates. That, of course, is a figure that needs to be taken in terms of what we would normally have received over that 5-year period. And I mean, we would normally, on current rates, have received about $110 billion over that period, of which we've lost 5.5. So it's 5.5 out of 110. I think it's important to sort of keep that perspective in mind. We live in an era in which we need to balance both fiscal security and national security, and indeed from a personal point of view I argue that one leads to the other. I mean, they're inseparable issues. Governments around the world have debt of staggering proportions. The total debt owing by governments is $41 trillion US. By and large, this is owing in countries of the West. They carry the burden. In some cases, the debt's greater than the annual GDP of the country that's carrying it. The US is reducing defence spending by $487 billion over 10 years, as announced by Leon Panetta in, I think, February this year. The UK has cut its defence expenditure by 8%. And so, as we write the new white paper over the coming months, in my mind the equation is simple. We have to be able to talk both dollars and strategy. Of course, to some people this sort of talk's anathema. You know, strategy is sometimes taught as holy writ. If it can't be allowed to be sullied or in any way soiled by money or reality, that mindset just doesn't cut it anymore. We've seen in the past what happens when we have a strategy that isn't matched by dollars. I'm not saying that strategy shouldn't be bold, that strategy shouldn't be ambitious. It certainly needs to be both of these things, but it also needs to be tempered by reality, affordability, and informed by the thinking and tasking of other government agencies. And that is the approach that we're taking with the new white paper, and the work is underway. Let me talk for a couple of minutes about priority and change. Next week I'll be coming up to the first anniversary of my return to the Defence Department, and at that time I set 5 priorities for the department. I said the first thing was to support our operationally deployed people. Our second priority was to provide the government with the best and the most effective defence capability that we can field within our resources. The third was to establish the department as a can-do, no-nonsense organisation focused on getting the job done. Fourthly, to pursue value for money for the Australian taxpayer. And finally, but not necessarily in priority order, improve the professional skills of our APS workforce. And I singled that out because I have a particular thing about the skill level of the APS workforce. It is patchy and we don't enjoy the same training machine, as you know, that the Australian Defence Force does. And I think that's something we need to address. Now, I believe we're doing reasonably well against most of those priorities. I'm convinced, for example, of the support to our operationally deployed people. It's at the front lobe of all of our minds. I see it everywhere as I travel from Perth to Darwin to Sydney. We're a large organisation, but the Defence family is a very close one, as the recent loss of Sergeant Blaine Diddams demonstrated to all of us. I went over for the ramp ceremony, and it's interesting when you know his father and you know the boy concerned, or man now, he's a grown man, it's a very personal thing. On the point of supporting our people more widely, you'd all be aware of the reviews that have been undertaken over the last 12 months, culminating in yesterday's release of Liz Broderick's review into the treatment of women in the Australian Defence Force. That was Liz's Part 2 report. She reported on Part 1, which was the investigation into the ADFA issue earlier. Both the CDF and I are committed to evolving Defence's culture to reflect modern community expectations. There is not a cigarette paper between David Hurley and myself with regard to this matter. It's very important and we need to get on the job, and we are. We've already agreed in principle to accept all of Liz Broderick's review. And in March this year, as you are probably aware, we released the document, The Pathways to Change, Evolving Defence Culture. That articulates our cultural intent. Mind you, it's a glossy document, and as you all know, a glossy document's meaningless until it's put into practice. And so that's the work that we're doing right now. I know, for example, that we are a can-do organisation. We have to be, whether it's providing support at short notice, as we are currently with the Nauru issue, or responding to natural disasters, or looking after our own citizens in the event of flood or fire or some sort of other domestic catastrophe. But I want to hark back to 2 of my priorities because these are important. Is the issue of providing the government with the best and the most effective defence capability that we can field, and secondly, the issue of pursuing value for money for the taxpayer. The Australian taxpayer, quite rightly, has a very low tolerance for cost blowouts and project overruns. Certainly of cost blowouts and project overruns of the size that we have seen. But we have, over the years, changed in many ways in the way we do business. We have a two-pass approval process going now for new acquisitions that was put in place following the Kinnaird Review in 2003. We've developed a 5-year defence corporate plan to ensure that we pursue enterprise alignment. Very difficult to keep the 106,000 people enterprise aligned. The corporate plan is supported by a defence annual plan, and a system of quarterly business enterprise reports are coming in, and we are finding greater utility in that system as the days go by. Underpinning all of this is, of course, the enterprise risk management framework. We have, just in the last 4 weeks, reissued the 4-year defence capability plan, which aligns now with the 4-year forward estimate period. I think this is important, just as a mechanic, to get the DCP aligned with the 4-year estimates. This provides industry, in my view, with early enough information on projected costs, goals and content, but still giving the sort of surety that the forward estimates give. We'll soon be publishing, in conjunction with that, a defence capability guidance document to cover the 6 years beyond that. So the 4-year DCP and then a 6-year defence capability guidance beyond that to give the 10-year throw forward. We've embedded a process for independent review of cost, schedule and risk and contestability. The contestability bit is something I want to emphasise. David Hurley and I are provided with independent assessments of the capability proposals that are to be considered by our government. This is a very valuable function. The contest of the assumptions of the sponsoring capability managers, as you know, capability managers can get excited from time to time about what they want, and it requires some form of moderation and some form of contestability to get all that in a box. And that is how we pursue the issue of getting value for money for the Australian taxpayer. And I think that that is working very well in the capability development space. We've seen some very encouraging progress in the project throughput over the past year. We put through 49 projects last year, in contrast to 28 approved the year before. And since 2000, there's been a doubling of the number of projects delivered on time. So in the space of a decade, we've doubled the number of projects delivered on time. Schedule slippage has been reduced from 50% in 2000 to about 30% in 2007, and it continues to move south. So that is on the improve. On average, projects are coming in on budget, and I say that with the qualification that, as you know, in some spectacular cases that does not occur. But on average, they are coming in on budget. I think that's a great credit to the work that's being done by the Capability Development Group and Warren King and the DMO. The point I want to make is that just as we've changed our capability acquisition procedures, we're going to have to change the rest of the organisation. This isn't new to us. Reform is what defence does. We've always reformed well before the Tang harangue. You come down through the ages, through the DRP in the 1990s, through to the SRP that we're running now. We've achieved our SRP targets, as some of you will know, for the years 2009-10 and 10-11, and I expect we'll come very close to meeting the targets for this financial year that's just gone. We're working that now. The challenge now is to keep meeting our targets and continue reform, because as you know, the ramp starts to come up here, and so it's not easy. A number of things have impacted the future of the SRP, including, of course, this year's budget and the strategic circumstances that we now face. Some of the streams that we've implemented are making good headway and show, in my view, great promise. They need to continue to be squeezed for all they're worth. Some of the streams have been squeezed to a point where they're starting to dry up. We need to squeeze them dry and put a line underneath them. And then we need to create some additional streams for further saving and reform. And ladies and gentlemen, the key here, everybody sort of fixates on the money, and that's necessary. But at the end of the day, it's all about reform. If we have saved the money but not reformed, we will have failed. We need to make sure that the reform continues to a successful conclusion. We have to find better and more economic ways of doing business. We've got to continue to dethatch. I've used this word publicly before. We need to dethatch our process. A good place to start, and in accordance with the recommendations of Rufus Black's review, was the infamous Defence Committee system. During the past year, CDF and I have disestablished 82 committees of the 335 that we had, and we're not finished yet. I think that's an important statistic. It shows you the kind of thatching that we have developed as a department over the years. Ministers of Defence have spoken in the past of transferring the funding burden from the tail to the teeth. I agree with them. In my opinion, we still have far too many functions which are duplicated across Defence. This is particularly true in acquisition, human resource management, finance and information, and communications technology. Through the shared services reform, which is underway right now, and that is a major reform initiative, we will streamline these functions and will improve the delivery of service and decrease the number of people that we currently have devoted to those services. Structurally, we have to achieve a more appropriate balance between personnel, operating and capital funding. And those three things, as you know, are historically points that challenge us, and we need to make sure that we get that balance right. We need to look very closely at the size and shape of the department, particularly as we draw down our operations in Afghanistan, in East Timor and in the Solomon Islands. Our organisation needs to be fit for purpose for our future strategic and budgetary environment. One trend that's evident over the last 20 years is the growing cost of our people. We've got very skilled ADF and APS workforce, and that workforce is consuming an increasing proportion of our resources. So the central question is, what do we do about all of this? Our need for resources is increasing. Our ability to provide those resources is not evidently increasing. And we know with some precision about the escalating cost of producing military capability. So where do we go from here? Well, we could do nothing, in which case our buying power will erode through time, and we will diminish as an organisation, and we will cease to provide for the Australian taxpayer the sort of military capability that they deserve. There is actually only one answer to the way forward. We've got to do business differently. We need to restructure, to reduce our overheads and materialise the necessary funding to provide the capabilities we need. As things stand, I don't think that we're fully structured to meet our likely strategic circumstances in the future. There's a job of work in front of me around that issue. Let me talk for a few minutes now about strategic outlook, and then I'll finish off. I mentioned earlier that some of our friends and allies were decreasing their military spending, the US, Britain and so on. But other nations in our region, as most of you will know, are taking advantage of their continued relative economic growth to increase military spending and modernisation. China is arguably doubling its defence budget every 5 years, and according to a recent report by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, India has announced a 17% rise in defence spending this year. Now, this creates a very interesting dynamic. China has a legitimate interest in our region. They're our biggest trading partner. They're the second largest economy in the world. They're Australia's largest source of tourism, our biggest source of overseas university students. You know all these measures. You hear them on a daily basis. In my view, it's in Australia's national economic and our national security interests, and in the interests of our entire region, that China remains prosperous. Separately, in spite of budget cutbacks, the US Secretary of Defence Leon Panetta announced in June this year that by 2020, the US would reposition up to 60% of its naval forces to the Asia-Pacific region, which includes 6 of their aircraft carriers. I was in the room, as I think some of you in this room might have been, when he made that speech, and I saw the flurry of people taking down notes. They were quoting him verbatim from all over the region as he made that very important speech. The cuts to Pentagon spending will not change the fact that by any objective measure, the US will continue to have the world's most powerful and capable military force out to 2030. Our alliance with the United States is one strategic anchor point for American engagement in the region, and it remains the cornerstone of our strategic and security arrangements. In the 60 years since the alliance entered into force, each new global challenge has deepened our cooperation. It's led to an ever-strong partnership, an ever-growing partnership grounded in shared values and shared interests. I would argue that the US presence has long provided an international public good. As economic and strategic weight shifts to the Asia-Pacific and to the Indian Ocean Rim, or to what some now refer to as the Indo-Pacific, the alliance is only increasing in importance for our own security and for the region's security and prosperity. This year we've seen the rotational deployment of US Marines to Darwin. These deployments will be of around 6 months' duration, and during that time there have been and there will be joint exercises and training between the US Marines and the ADF. This will build Australia's capacity to respond to regional crises by helping us to learn how best to use some of our new defence investments, such as the major boost to amphibious capability, to come online over the next couple of years. The understanding that we live in a maritime domain has always featured heavily in our strategic planning, and it'll continue to do so. As a number of countries in the region transition from concerns with internal security and nation building to become more outward looking, the importance and challenges of the maritime environment come into sharper relief. This environment is fundamental to their economic growth. It's fundamental to their economic growth. Over time, as trade and opportunities for resource exploitation increase, the importance of the maritime environment grows, as does its potential as an arena for contest and for conflict. We're seeing this now to some degree in the South China Sea. Across the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asia and into the Pacific Ocean extend some of the world's great strategic trade highways. You all know the statistics around the traffic that flows along those arteries. The sheer scale of our own resource development in Australia only adds to the significance of the maritime regions to our north and to our west. $190 billion has been invested in the extraction of offshore LNG in Australia's northwest. These projects have made us the world's fastest growing exporter of LNG, on our way to becoming the second largest LNG exporter by 2015. So the stakes are high. The management of competing economic interest will be a test of regional governance, institutions and diplomacy. The challenges for policymakers will be to construct the workable frameworks that support security for all in this environment of high interdependency. In my view, we do this by engaging through regional architecture, such as the EAS, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum and the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus. These forums have shown hopeful signs of being able to navigate some of the more challenging strategic issues in the region. We have to keep working with them as they mature. Through both an enhanced ADF presence and a regular US deployment in Northern Australia, we'll also be better positioned to work within the region, not just through dialogue, but through real practical engagement along bilateral, trilateral and multilateral lines. And I must say this issue of multilateralism has been the most astonishing thing for me in the past few months. I have been present on 2 occasions when President SBY has mentioned his support for the operation of the US Marines, the ADF, the Indonesian Armed Forces and others out to and including China becoming involved in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief exercises and so on. That's quite a remarkable change, as many of you will know, for the region. Through both an enhanced ADF presence and regular deployments of the Marines in the north, I think we will be much better plugged in to the region. Exercise Pitch Black just finished last week. It's seen participation from ourselves, the United States, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia and New Zealand. It was terrific that the New Zealanders brought down for the first time the Su-30 flanker aircraft. It's the first time those aircraft have been outside Indonesia, and that's quite a milestone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to conclude here and then I'll take your questions, but as we look to the next white paper, I'm very conscious of the fact that our future as a defence organisation begins here. It begins here and it begins now. We face some very serious strategic and budgetary challenges. As I said in my introduction, our aspirations may not easily match the available funding, and we face a very expensive proposition over the next 20 years as many of our platforms reach their life of type and we look to replacing them. As countries in the region prosper economically and increase their investment in new defence equipment, we're going to have to decide how to respond, While acquisition of advanced capabilities such as the Growler that was announced today serve to maintain a technology edge, the general long-term challenge of maintaining a technology edge across the board will be increasingly difficult. In my mind, one way to mitigate this risk is to work with our regional neighbours and our partners, participating in and fostering bilateral, trilateral, multilateral linkages and building capabilities both for ourselves and for them that will enable us to work together for mutual advantage. This future engagement will be built on our achievements of the past and I think through the labour of our efforts into the future. The second way that we reduce our risk is by doing defence business differently. There's no doubt in my mind that we are going to have to change the shape of our defence organisation. We need to reform our enterprise, to reduce administrative overheads and redirect money to creating military capability. We've come a long way since the Tang harangue. The services in 1973, we've moved a long way from that state of affairs. But if we don't go further, if we don't go much further, we run the risk of becoming less relevant. As an eminent colleague of mine, some of you will know him, General Pete Schoomaker, former commander of US Special Operations Command and Chief of Staff of the US Army, once said, "History judges harshly those organisations that will not change." And so it is for the Australian Defence Organisation. I can assure you that I'm devoting my energies, David Hurley is devoting his energies to the considerable task of building the defence organisation that will stand for the future. And as Arthur Tang taught us, it links dollars to strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I would be happy to take your questions for a few minutes or as long as you will indulge me.
Well, Duncan, thank you very much for that. Not exactly a harangue, I think, but certainly a pretty tough-minded assessment of the challenges which face the Defence Organisation over the next few years. Now, the Secretary has said he will take a few questions. I think maybe 10 minutes or so is what we can afford before the chef will start to get aggravated. And Duncan, because I'm on my feet, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask you first. You talked about the US and you talked about China, and obviously you know that the flavour of the month in terms of the public debate is somehow the need, it is argued that Australia should have to make a choice between these two countries as the Chinese economy ultimately overtakes that of the US. I would guess from what you've said, you probably don't think that's right, but my question to you is, so how do we avoid having to take that choice?
Yeah, Peter, can you hear me, ladies and gentlemen, if I move forward of the lectern? The first observation I would make is that our destiny, that is the destiny of all of us in this room, and probably our kids' destiny, will be largely determined, in my view, by the relationship between Washington and Beijing into the future. I mean, I think that bilateral relationship is going to be the driving force in where we all end up. Now, you can fold India into the equation, you can fold all sorts of people into the equation, but I think that bilateral relationship is going to be a key. For us, I would suggest nimbleness is probably the answer to your question, because we will have potentially in, I don't know, 40 years' time, maybe longer, a navy that might be exercising sort of superiority, if you like, around our shores that is not our major ally for the first time in our history. Now, the US Navy buffs might contest that, but you know it is a distinct possibility. You wouldn't write it off. We are faced with that exquisite situation where our major ally is not, in fact, one of or even our major trading partner, and so that sort of contradiction is clear. But I think so long as we get what I would describe as habitual structures and frameworks in place for dialogue, that the US, I don't underestimate the US's agility in this business. We often, in my view, take the stance that people are simple in Washington. I don't subscribe to that. I think there is a degree of sophistication in this whole thing. you know, we've heard that argument about the bridge. You know, I think that's nonsense. You know, Australia providing some sort of bridge between those two countries don't require us to provide a bridge. But I think we need to watch their relationship very carefully, and it will require a nimble response. I was in China with Dave Hurley a couple of months ago, and it's quite interesting, you know, as you're engaging the Chinese as the years go by, you know, and they're always sort of testing this issue of the US alliance, and, you know, the new white paper will be a good opportunity to correct this, you know, and be able to fix all this. Well, I mean, that's a constant, that's the sort of line they've been taking for years, but I'm not despondent about it. I think we have two enormous powers here, one growing and one existential. I am still sort of glass half full in balance. I'm not a rose-coloured glass idiot, but I am still reasonably positive.
Duncan, thank you very much for an interesting summary of reform in the department. As you know, the Defence Association has always championed reform in the department. There was one area I think you didn't touch on, and that is the ministerial supervision, the structure of it. We've had a serious problem for many years, but certainly over the last few years with a considerable throughput of ministers, and the responsibilities of the various ministers and junior ministers changing dramatically, and the ministerial team, in fact, changing completely on a number of occasions. Have you and the CDF put any thought into suggesting to the government that the accountability of the department would improve dramatically if we could have a more permanent structure in terms of the structure of ministerial supervision that wasn't so dependent on politics that's laid out from time to time internally within the department?
Neil, the only thing that disturbs me about your question is the throughput of ministers is only exceeded by the throughput of secretaries. So I would have to start at home in that regard. The answer is no. I mean, I don't think it is proper, in fact, to even engage in those sort of discussions. The elected government of the day will do what it will. You could make representation, but it's not going to change the way in which any cabinet is constructed or junior ministries are arranged or whatever. I think that's just part of the rough and tumble of the game, and I would regard myself as being sort of barking at parked cars if I was to go down that line. I wouldn't do it.
Don't do that, Secretary. We'll go to Jeff Barker now.
Mr. Secretary, in two recent speeches, Minister Smith said that core capabilities will continue to be delivered into the future. For the sake of clarity, would you tell us what is a core capability as distinct from a non-core capability? Would you tell us how these core capabilities are to be delivered on what you've indicated to be much smaller budgets than you've had, given that the price of capabilities is increasing all the time?
Yeah, Jeff, thanks. I won't be able to list all of these, but as you know, through history, we've had through recent history at any rate, we've had a number of what we refer to as core capabilities, which go to issues such as, and I take them by environment, taking the maritime environment, sea control, subsurface warfare, in the air control, in the air domain, it's to do with the new air combat capability and attaining sort of air superiority that we have laid out as to where we want to achieve it and how we want to achieve it and in what size. And with the land domain, of course, it relates to the size of the various formations and units that we have able to deploy at relatively short notice to do various tasks. So, I mean, I won't bore you with the nauseous detail of all of that, but we have quite clearly a list of core capabilities. Now, the non-core capabilities are a bit more tricky because they fall into two categories. There are the kind of, to say nice to have is too strong, they are capabilities which kind of round out the force and make it a sort of a more complete entity. But there are also capabilities in there which are essential enablers, and that's the tricky part. You often hear the discussion about the hollow force, and as I look around this audience tonight, I see there's a number of people here who lived hollowness for much of their working lives. It's those enabling capabilities that you have to be very careful of in terms of if you start thinning them out, because they do, in the end, reduce all of these more spectacular and more expensive major capabilities. With regard to how we pay for this, I'm sorry maybe I didn't make it clear when I was speaking, but the unit cost of military capability is increasing through time. Warren can stand here and give you 15 minutes on the percentage increase that's going on, how much of it is due to inflation, how much of it is due to technology improvement, and a number of other factors. So we know how much it's increasing in cost. We have some indication of what the forward budget projections might be, and I hope I made the point clearly that if we do nothing, our buying power will diminish through time. If we had $100 today, in 10 years' time, that $100 will only buy $10 worth of stuff. And we have to do better than that. The way in which we do better is to ensure that there is absolutely no fat in the structure that we're running. We have to become lean. We have to do business in a different way. It's not a matter of just tweaking the edges around the department. We can't just sort of start doing the little screwdriver movements. There needs to be some fairly fundamental changes in the way we do business. Sorry, long answer, Jeff, but I hope that helps.
Let's take one more question before we close the debate. Professor Detach.
Duncan, I think I may be the only person in the room who actually worked for Sir Arthur Tang, and you're right, you said strategy without money ain't strategy. He also said that a defence planner without a map of his or her country is not a defence planner. Which brings me to a couple of points. The first one is David Hurley has foreshadowed that after withdrawal from Afghanistan and East Timor and the Solomons, which you mentioned, he would not want us to be in the same predicament as undoubtedly we were. You and I remember only too well after Vietnam. We were a department, an organisation, and a defence force. We didn't know where we were going, where our priorities were. The second and related point is, I noticed the Minister has said in his speech, both here in ASPI on the 1st of August and at the Lowy Institute on the 9th, that A, we need to refocus on the defence of the North of Australia, force posture review, and secondly, words to the effect that the focus on our neighbourhood is crucial. Would you care to just say something about the post-Vietnam parallel and how we should avoid that, and then this second issue of our abiding strategic geography?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. Yes, unfortunately, we're both of sufficient years to have done this journey together. With regard to the drawdown following current operations in the Middle East and close to home, I think the fact that there's been so much recognition of that by the current leadership of the department, indeed by the government, and of course by many of you in this room, gives me some degree of confidence that we wouldn't follow the same path again. I mean, it's always the danger, and at the end of the day, it's always driven, well, not always, but it's frequently driven by the dollars, but sometimes it's driven by neglect, and we need to make sure that that does not happen again. My sense is that the region, and this is without being unkind to the neighbourhood, the region, the near region, I mean, is sufficiently, volatile is too strong a word, but it's sufficiently sort of turbulent for us not to drop our guard entirely. I mean, we will still have to keep a weather eye on some of the smaller, fragile states in our immediate neighbourhood. So I think that will help, rather than the sort of complete abandonment that went on, you know, the sort of the rout, if you like, on the retreat from Saigon. So I think the circumstances are different in that regard. With regard to the issue of focus on the northwest, you know, our near region, look, I am in that camp personally. I stand here before you as a proud West Australian. I've been very worried for years about what's going on in the northwest of the country. The question is what we do about that. And I know when Alan and Rick were doing their force posture review, you know, there was much sort of speculation around that, oh, well, it'll just recommend that we create a whole bunch of bases in the north. Well, we wouldn't do that for the very same reason that the workforce that's up there now is fly in, fly out. Otherwise you'd build a city up there. So, you know, I think that analogy is very strong. What we need to do is make sure that we can get assets up into that region on a regular, routine, sustainable basis. Quite clearly we've got an increasing asset off the northwest of the country. I am a subscriber to the Indo-Pacific concept. I think that whole business, if you look at this, you know, I'm not a businessman, but if you look at the industry of Northern Asia and the energy of the Gulf and tie those two things together with that enormous sort of blue line that you see drawn, you know, with the shipping lines, that is a economic system and a very important economic system. And we just happen to sit, very fortunately, sort of at the bottom of the crescent. And I think we probably need to leverage that sort of advantage of geography more than we do. I think the north of the country will always remain a challenge for us, but quite frankly I don't see any sort of major change to our basing footprint. It's a matter of making sure that we've got the necessary facilities up there to maintain, as I say, this regular, sustainable, frequent presence in the area.
Secretary, thank you so much. It just remains for me to ask the CEO of Serco, David Campbell, to move a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Secretary, for an exceptional and illuminating address. I think you'll agree that Duncan's provided an enormous amount to consider this evening. Just touching on a couple of points that sort of intrigue me. In my current role, I get to travel a lot around the region, India, China, throughout Asia extensively. And what really intrigues me, and every time I land at an airport, whether it's in northern India or in Singapore or elsewhere in Asia, the military man comes out of me and I'm looking at capability and it's intriguing the dynamic environment that we live within this region, the whole of the Asia region. And just the other day, landing in a place called Detach in northern India, a phalanx of military helicopters based in a quite remote location. It's a really dynamic environment, and the Australian Defence sits directly within that. I was intrigued and encouraged, in a sense, to listen to the mantra of Arthur Tang and talking about matching dollars to strategy, and that's particularly relevant in this very difficult fiscal environment that we face at the moment and seems to be continuing to face into the future. Now, putting on my businessman's hat, doing defence business is quite difficult from an industry perspective, and I think we would be looking to how we could contribute to encouraging reform and change. I think defence itself needs to look at that, and I was encouraged, Secretary, to look at some of the initiatives you've taken already, reducing overheads, reducing numbers of committees, and how else you might change. And I think your comment that fundamental, you use the term, not the small screwdriver or screw movement, fundamental change is something that may well be there. I was intrigued that you, and delighted, pleased, as the father of 3 daughters, that you touched on the Liz Broderick report and some of the fundamental changes that are quite necessary, altering some of the cultures. I can recall back in my days as an officer cadet in Portsea in 1970, that behaviours there were just something that would be probably prosecuted and people would be jailed today. Yet we still need further fundamental change, and you acknowledge the need for that change, and I applaud you for that. At the end of the day, for me, and I take back my businessman's hat and put on an officer's hat, and I say the thing for me that is encouraging is, at the end of the day, you bring to the business an understanding that at the end of the day, this is about national security, and that's not just about defence, it's about national security, the economic environment, the cultural environment, the environmental circumstances we sit within. But it comes down to, for me, operational delivery and the unique nature of defence. That is, the forces on the ground, in the air and on the sea, and providing them with capability to deliver that national defence policy. Duncan, thank you for illuminating result, and I'd ask you to all to thank Duncan appropriately. Thank you.